Americans achieve those retirement and health care security than was the case the last time we balanced a budget. In other words, more Americans, millions more retiring, and yet, as a share of our economy, they want to provide less, both for investing in education and assuring the future of those individuals. And despite the claim that this is such a pressing issue, our Republican colleagues have refused to shut down one tax break for the purpose of reducing the deficit or helping to shore up Medicare. Let me just show you a chart here. What this chart shows is that according to the Congressional Budget Office, the revenue from tax expenditures, so-called tax breaks, exceeds the amount that we spend in any one year on Social Security, exceeds the amount we spend on Medicare and Medicaid combined. Now, let's go to the next chart. What this shows is that 17% of the benefits of those tax expenditures and tax breaks go to the top 1% of American income owners, okay? So the position our Republican colleagues have taken is we've got to address these issues, but we're not prepared to close one tax loophole to do that. In fact, they passed a proposal to eliminate the estate tax on estates of couples over $10 million. They're growing that number on the previous chart of tax expenditures, even as they tell us that they want to address these pressing issues in the short term and the long term. So it is completely contradictory to say this is an absolutely important priority, and at the same time to say you're unwilling to take away a tax break from a single hedge fund manager in order to accomplish that priority. So I look forward to the discussion, Mr. Chairman, but it's important to have this framework as we move along. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. I live under this fanciful notion that we can actually have a sober conversation and discussion around here about the largest challenges that we have in this town. I tell folks back home that I'm an eternal optimist. So let me revisit one sentence in my opening statement, and that is that my goal that this hearing will stay focused on the entrepreneurial spirit of young Americans and not politics. With that, let me yield a few moments to the gentleman.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Let me yield a few moments to the gentleman from West Virginia who has a constituent here on the panel. Mr. Mooney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very pleased to have West Virginia native and state delegate from Martinsburg, West Virginia native testify before us. Recently turned 19 years old, Saira Blair is the youngest state delegate in the country. In fact, she won the primary, defeating a two-term incumbent in that primary at the age of 17. And actually, the first election she was eligible to vote in, she was able to go and vote for herself. She's a full-time student at West Virginia University with studying economics and Spanish. Her goal is to be a financial advisor. She's a sophomore now, and when she's not studying and being a state delegate, she still works about 20 hours a week as a waitress to help pay for her college bills. Sarah's passionate about making sure that her generation has the opportunity to realize the American dream, get a good education, and find a meaningful job without being encumbered by historic levels of national debt. Saira also understands that we need to come up with new, innovative ideas to make sure that the programs that protect our most vulnerable members of society remain strong for future generations. She has a unique platform that she can use to share the importance of responsible budget policy to the rising generation of American voters. I'm so glad Saira is able to be here with us today. Proud to represent her in Congress. I look forward to hearing what she has to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mooney. Ask unanimous consent that any members who wish to submit a statement for the record may do so within 7 calendar days. Without objection, so ordered. I want to once again welcome our witnesses to this hearing today, Delegate Blair, Mr. Meyer, Ms. Vallas, and Mr. Baehr. Thank you for your time today. The committee has received your written statements, and without objection, they will be made a part of the formal record. You will each have 5 minutes to deliver your opening oral remarks. And Delegate Blair, you may begin when you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, the members of the Budget Committee, for allowing me to come here and speak today. As Congressman Mooney mentioned, I am a lifelong resident of the state of West Virginia, as well as serving in the legislature. I'm also a student, And I often get asked, why would you give up what most people consider the best years of your life in college, not really having any responsibility to serve in the West Virginia legislature? And my answer is always the same, and it's a simple one to me. And my goal is really to prove to people that they don't have to be 40, 50, or 60 to have an impact and to be engaged in the policy that's going to be affecting them. After all, the legislation that is passed today does affect the millennial generation and the ones after us more so than it affects the current one serving. So I think we at least deserve one vote in the West Virginia House on things that will be affecting us. Every day, I watch my friends and my family get their high school education in West Virginia, they get their college education in West Virginia, and then they leave the state because we don't have enough good paying jobs to keep them here. As I've gone on, I've noticed with the advances of technology and transportation that they're not just leaving West Virginia, they're leaving the country as well, especially my friends who are studying in the STEM fields where they have better opportunities if they leave this country. And that's scary because that's a loss of our GDP, as my economics textbook will tell me. I'm an economics major. That we're losing some of our best and our brightest citizens because we just don't have enough opportunity and we don't have enough to keep them here. And no offense, but raising the taxes is the lazy way to fix the problem. We need to be creative and we need to be innovative with our solutions. My friends come up to me and they don't even realize it, but they're giving ideas to me and they're talking about the problems that they face when they talk about how they get their paycheck and they're mad that they see some of the taxes gone and they say, I don't even know where this goes. Will I ever get this? And I explain to them and then they say, oh, that's a program that I've learned about. I've watched the debt clock before because that's always my favorite way to tell people to get engaged is to watch the US debt clock because most people are visual learners and there's actually an app and I encourage whenever I'm speaking, I've been to a few cities the last few months, Boston, Austin, Denver, and a couple in Canada. And every time I'm there, even the Canadians love it. I say, download the US debt clock app. And their eyes just light up and they say, there's no way that we could ever recover that. And that's the response from those who are 40 to 50, they say, we're done. When I talk to high school students, the first thing they say is, what can we do? They're not hopeless. They are very, very, very optimistic about fixing the problem, and they offer solutions in order to do it. And more than anything, I think they just feel frustrated. That's the usual response that I get. But they do have answers. The program that I was involved in high school was called the Youth in Government. And about 300 high school students from around the state of West Virginia went down to the Capitol. We wrote a bill. We presented it on the House floor. We debated in committees. It was very much the procedure that I now do in the West Virginia House of Delegates. And some of the ideas that students came up with were ingenious. And the program's been around forever all across the country. A lot of people don't know, but the white lines on the right side of the road was created by a 17-year-old, that idea. Having your picture on a driver's license was an idea of a high school student, and so many more. And people don't realize how much of an impact that the younger generations have. But it's very important for them to get involved at every level, the local, the state as well. And I think it's important for all state legislatures, including West Virginia and all the state legislators involved in it, to realize the impact that they will have at the federal level, because I think a lot of people think, oh, it's hopeless, our state, especially one as small as West Virginia, can't have any form of an impact. And that's not true. We really need to embrace the concept of federalism. My state could be used as a petri dish with ideas that could potentially be utilized at the national level later on. West Virginia actually has one of the youngest legislatures. We have 8 members who are under the age of 30. We actually have what we like to call the Young Gun Caucus, because there's 8 of us, and we all ran for the same reason, that we're afraid for the future, for our children, for our grandchildren, and honestly for ourselves. We're a little bit selfish. That is one characteristic of millennials, is that Yes, we are compassionate on a lot of social issues, but when it comes to the economy, we are selfish. We want what we put in. And so our goal is to responsibly spend today to fix the problems of yesterday to protect tomorrow. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Meyer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Well, Chairman Price, Vice Chairman Rokita, and Ranking Member Van Hollen, and other members of the House Budget Committee, thank you for the opportunity to give testimony on the financial burdens facing young people in today's economy. I'm a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and as Chairman Price said, the co-author of the book, Disinherited: How Washington's Betraying America's Young. Over the past 3 months, I've traveled across the country talking about the book and speaking with young people about the economic problems that they're facing. And what I've found, young people ages 20 to 24 face an unemployment rate of 9%. Over 6 years into economic recovery, many young people are asking, what recovery? They're not seeing it. And this is especially problematic given that millennials are facing 2 separate, unprecedented debt burdens. The first, student loan debt, has been driven by poor federal policies. The second, unfunded health and retirement programs, was never voted on or approved by the young, yet they are still liable for paying for the decisions made by past policymakers. America's federal policies need to shift to reflect the growing public realization that both of these debts and the burdens that they place on young people's futures are unsustainable and unfair. Action sooner rather than later is no longer an option. It's a necessity. At $1.3 trillion, student loan debt is widespread. College tuition has increased by over 1,200% since records began being kept in 1978, and over that time, food costs have only increased by 250%. For my graduating class of 2013, about 70% of my peers needed to take out student loans, and average debt at graduation approached $30,000. Not only does the government's $165 billion in annual spending on student loans, tax credits, and Pell Grants do little to offset this burden, but actually it's contributing to the problem. The federal loan program is effectively an individually tailored subsidy to each school. Research from the U.S. Treasury Department has found that for every dollar provided in tax-based aid, scholarships fell a dollar. The New York Federal Reserve recently estimated that every dollar in increased subsidized federal loans leads to a 65-cent increase in college tuition. Universities do not lose by admitting a federally subsidized millennial who ends up not graduating. The school still receives tuition payments, and if the student drops out, another misled freshman can take their place and their funding next semester. Only 39% of students entering a 4-year university graduate within 4 years, and within 6 years of entering school, graduation rates are still below 60%. Low graduation rates are the main reason why 34% of those who owe under $5,000 end up defaulting on their student loans. This is far lower than the 18% of borrowers who default when they owe over $100,000. So outstanding student loan debt is indeed a crisis. I think we can all agree on this. But talk of free or debt-free college does nothing to address the underlying reason why student loan debt is increasing, the perverse incentives created by today's federal student loan program. Moving to health and retirement programs, many people know that America is $18 trillion in debt. But this only captures a portion of the total fiscal burden. When future spending obligations on health and retirement programs such as Social Security and Medicare are compared with future tax receipts, what's planned on being paid in, the so-called fiscal gap is estimated at over $200 trillion. Absent reform to promised benefits, young Americans are left with 2 options. They can either pay substantially higher taxes to receive the same level of services that their parents did, or they can receive they can pay the same rate as their elders and receive far fewer benefits. But both of these outcomes are unfair to young people. Washington has been handicapped by health and retirement programs that were created by past policymakers. Right now, mandatory spending, as Chairman Price brought up, on Social Security and Medicare, it takes up 13% of GDP, whereas discretionary spending is only 7%. This leaves much less, fewer dollars to be used for more essential functions of government. And if trends continue, workers my age and all of our age could end up paying a combined employer-employee payroll tax cost rate of 31% in 2050 just to cover Social Security and Medicare. That's more than double the rate that's paid today and would be a major cut to take-home pay. And it should be celebrated that life expectancy has increased and health outcomes have greatly improved since Social Security and Medicare were put into place. However, these programs need to adjust with the new realities. While poverty among some members of the elderly population is still a problem that we need to address, today's retirees differ drastically from those of the past. The average household headed by someone aged 65 years and older has over 50 times the wealth of a household headed by someone 35 years and younger. And back in 1984, this ratio was only 10 to 1, so it's an increasing wealth gap between the old and young. While writing the course of America's fiscal ship will not be easy, delaying action, it only makes matters worse. But thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions and diving much deeper into these complex issues later on in the hearing.
Mr. Meyer, appreciate it. Ms. Vallas, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today. My name is Rebecca Vallas, and I'm the Director of Policy of the Poverty to Prosperity Program at the Center for American Progress. Real median incomes of young people have plummeted over the past 3 decades, meaning that members of the millennial generation are making thousands of dollars less each year in real terms than previous generations did when they were our age. Additionally, more than 70% of minimum wage workers are 16 to 34, but the minimum wage today is lower in real terms than it was in 1968. Millennials, as we've heard, are also facing high rates of unemployment as well as record-breaking levels of student debt. And millennials are facing these challenges right as our generation is starting our own families, with the steep costs that child rearing brings. But despite claims to the contrary, our generation is not facing these economic challenges because our nation is spending too much on Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid. Alarmist claims that these vital programs are putting us on the brink of ruin, or that the only, quote, solutions are to slash or privatize, are as old as the programs themselves, and they're as wrong today as they were 80 years ago. The truth is, these challenges are the result of an off-kilter economy that is only working for the wealthy few, and it's not working for millennials. While Social Security is typically thought of as a retirement program, 3.5 million millennials currently receive Social Security today, and it will be especially important to our generation when we prepare to retire due to an increasingly inadequate private retirement system. Just 40% of workers under 35 even have an employer-provided retirement plan, and half of workers under 35 have no retirement savings whatsoever. Moreover, with an average benefit of just $1,290 per month, most retirees are not living high on the hog, and cuts would push them into or deeper into poverty. Millennials who only recently moved out of their parents' homes could find their parents moving in with them, a scary thought even for those of us who get along with our parents. While Social Security faces a projected shortfall over the next 75 years, this challenge is both expected and manageable. The program will be able to pay all promised benefits for the next nearly 2 decades, and it does not add a penny to the deficit. The program has no borrowing authority, and by law, it cannot deficit spend. While the Social Security Disability Insurance Trust Fund is projected to deplete its reserves at the end of next year, all that's needed to prevent this needless shortfall is a routine and modest reallocation of payroll taxes to put both funds on sound footing until 2034, providing ample time to address the combined trust fund's 75-year shortfall. Now, worth noting, a significant driver of Social Security's shortfall is rising income inequality. In fact, a CAP analysis found that if not for rising inequality over the past 3 decades, the trust funds would be more than $1.1 trillion larger today. Restoring the payroll tax to 90% of covered wages, the payroll tax cap to 90% of covered wages, where President Reagan said it in 1983, would on its own close more than 1/4 of the shortfall. And lifting that cap further or eliminating it entirely would improve the program's fiscal outlook even more substantially. The only way Social Security won't be there for our generation is if we let its critics fool us into thinking that it must be slashed or eliminated. Millennials value Social Security highly and want to see it strengthened, not cut. In fact, in a recent survey conducted by the nonpartisan National Academy of Social Insurance, not only were millennials strongly opposed to cutting Social Security, more than 3/4 said they want to see benefits increased, and they were willing to pay more to see that happen. Now, some claim that if we were to spend less on our nation's seniors, we could afford to invest more in young Americans, but this sets up a false choice. The truth is, with the right budget choices, we can invest in young people, strengthen the middle class, ensure the long-term solvency of our nation's bedrock social insurance programs, and address our long-term deficit. And note that when proponents of this narrative design budgets that cut spending for older Americans, they don't then turn around and invest those savings in young people. For example, the FY16 congressional budget slashes health care for seniors while also cutting Pell Grants, job training, child care, I could go on, all to pay for lopsided tax cuts for the wealthy and corporations. Rather than failed trickle-down policies, it is a strong middle class that generates economic growth. And so in order to build an economy that works for millennials, we must therefore build an economy that works for all Americans. Our budget deficit has shrunk dramatically in recent years, and while many of the policies recommended by the Bowles-Simpson Commission were flawed, that report offers a useful illustration of why continued sequestration, let alone deeper spending cuts, is unnecessary. And that's because we have not only met, but already exceeded the spending cut targets in Bowles-Simpson. I'll conclude by noting that recent history has shown that slashing vital programs is not only harmful to current and future generations, it costs jobs and it hampers economic growth. Cuts in discretionary spending since 2010 are estimated to have cost our economy 1.2 million jobs. And a CAP analysis looking at the House budget proposal finds that the cuts to nutrition assistance would cost our economy another 286,000 jobs in just the first year alone. It's long past time to acknowledge we can't address our long-term fiscal challenges with just spending cuts, not without gutting or outright eliminating investments that are critical to current and future generations. What our generation needs in order to restore our trust is policies that invest in job creation, boost wages, and expand opportunity, not a continued fixation on austerity at the expense of economic growth. I refer you to my written testimony for a full discussion and a list of priorities about how we can invest in millennials, and I thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you. Mr. Baehr, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. So for years, I wanted to be like you guys. I ran for city council, I lost. I worked in DC at think tanks and even served as a legislative aide on Capitol Hill. Because I believe that, because I cared about the world, the way to change the world around you was to work in public policy. Well, I don't share that opinion anymore, and I'm thankful to the Chairman Price for having me here to share that story. So a few years ago, I met a man named Peter Thiel. And Peter made a powerful argument to me. He said, you know, precisely young people that want to change the world should do so by creating for-profit companies. Peter's brought that spirit to bear on some big issues. Wrangling in the Fed, he created PayPal. Get to Mars, SpaceX, combat terrorism, it's Palantir. Well, the good news is that my generation, the millennials on this panel, we share this spirit. Over 55% of us say that we want to start a company. That's great news. Well, what do we say about how we're going to get there? Well, it turns out we say hard work, ambition, and self-discipline are ways we're going to get there. What's at the bottom of that list of over 20 factors? Government services. In fact, polls say that over 55% of millennials believe that when we retire, Social Security won't even exist. So largely this means we are a go-it-alone generation. AngelList, LegalZoom, Amazon Web Services, Code Academy, and others have democratized innovation in a way that we all get to take part. But here's the problem. It isn't just that government doesn't get it. It's that government stops many of us who do. So there are burgeoning tech industries out there, like genomics, mobile health, Bitcoin, 3D printing, even MOOCs, that could dramatically lower the costs and improve services that government provides, with huge implications for entitlement programs, but they're caught in Washington's crosshairs. Coursera and Udacity want to democratize education. The State Department banned their export of the content. 23andMe wanted every American to understand their genetic code so they could better understand their disease risk. The FDA, for all intents and purposes, banned the product. My previous company, Outbox, wanted to dramatically reduce paper waste and transportation cost by modernizing the United States Postal Service. And in an epic meeting just down the street here in Washington, D.C., we met with the head of the Postal Service, who looked us in the eye, and he said, "The problem is Outbox is not going to work. Quote, digital is a fad. It will only work in Europe," end quote. And that was the end of that business. Well, what used to be merely benign incompetence, like when John McCain referred to face space in my book, has turned into an active malevolence. So what do Burundi, Afghanistan, and Mongolia have in common? Well, the World Bank actually says that each of those countries is a better place to start a company than the United States. We rank number 46 in the world. That's not that surprising when you think about the contrast between technology and the US government, where we make websites and web applications with no period of review. You guys have pre-market reviews. We have freedom of speech and marketing. You guys have quiet periods and off-label marketing bans. We drive early adoption, and you guys require licenses. To summarize, if the motto of the millennials is to move fast and break things, DC's motto might as well be, if you move too fast, we'll break you. So there's a new strategy here that companies such as Uber, Airbnb, and my new company, Able, employ. When we encounter broken systems, we design products that enable people to work together to solve complex problems. In the case of my company, Able, Washington has tightened restrictions on banks, meaning that small businesses in Main Street America can't access the credit that they deserve. So facing this, we built the world's first collaborative lending platform so that friends, family, and fans can work together to fund the Fortune 5 million, the 5 million small businesses that are responsible for the creation of 2/3 of all jobs and the employment of half the workforce. Small businesses in 40 states today can get funded at ablelending.com. And it's stories that I've told before today are reflected in the borrowers and the people we get to support as a company. A passion for outdoor adventure and love for helping people led Greg McKevely to create Kamek, a premium outdoor gear company whose hammocks and sleeping bags equip and inspire thousands of people to be more active. An undiagnosed illness led Kelly Love and Allison Evans on a quest to rid homes of toxic cleaning products. So today, Branch Basics has over 25,000 fans who get to clean free of toxic chemicals. Meanwhile, after a visit to post-Katrina New Orleans, Michael McDaniel founded Reaction, whose modular housing system, these are little molds of it, can actually be put on a semi-truck, 25 of them, driven to a place 4 men can unload them in 1 hour and provide safe, secure housing for 100 people, okay? These are millennial entrepreneurs who seek to transform the world that they live in through a for-profit company that delights its customers, honors and respects its employees, and returns a profit to its investors. In advance of this hearing, we asked our community what they wanted to share with you, and we have over 100 submissions included in the testimony that I provided to you today. As we work to learn a little bit more about each other, us millennials about Congress, and Congress about us millennials, my hope is that you two might start to move a little faster, maybe break a few things, and that you let us do so likewise. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Fascinating testimony and interesting contrast. I appreciate your time with us today. Delegate Blair, I'm struck by the obviously your youth and involvement in the political process, and I know that you said that one of the reasons that you sought public office in the first place was because of the national debt. And when I talk about that, I talk about it ad nauseum. I have my colleagues are tired of me talking about it, especially those not on the committee, who we try to get their attention. But when I talk about it, when you talk about it with your peers, do you sense that there really is an understanding or an appreciation of the challenges that we have and the magnitude of that challenge? And if so, how does that manifest itself in those conversations or in the concerns that your peers have?
Yeah, we absolutely do talk about it. I think it breaks down to, if you divide it by the number of people living in the country right now, I think it's about $55,000 worth of debt per person, and I think it's $155,000 worth of debt per taxpayer. And so a lot of my friends are still in high school. They haven't entered the workforce yet. They're not paying taxes yet, and they have no desire to. Why would they want to? And that's a problem that we're struggling with my generation to start with, is that there's not a lot of self-dependency. Everything is handed to my generation. I wouldn't deny that for a second. People are used to taking the easy way out, especially in West Virginia. We have something that I'm very grateful for. It's called the Promise Scholarship. And so you get a 3.5 in high school, I believe, and for your GPA, and a 1,700, I think, on the SAT, and your full college tuition is paid for to any in-state public school. And so we have several recipients from every high school. They get to college and they fool around. They don't take it seriously because they were handed this money with very little effort to themselves. It's a large strain on our state budget. And I think we're going to start to see the same thing with them in a few years when they're handed money through the federal government and they didn't have to work for it. Therefore, they're not going to take spending it as seriously. And so people who are looking into entering the workforce and giving it their all are not excited to have to bear the burden of others, I think, in a lot of ways. And especially because a lot of the jobs that they're going into are they're taking a risk for, and so they're already kind of hesitant on going into, because there's so many jobs that are created every day. I mean, we lose jobs every day. In my state alone, the coal is the biggest thing that we have, and we know that that's on the decline. And so there will be a new form of, I'm very confident that my generation will be the one to create a new energy efficient, economically efficient form of energy, and there are people that are currently developing that, but they're afraid to take that risk because they see how much debt that they have on them, and they're faced with so many challenges that I think.
Thanks. Mr. Meyer, I was struck by, in your written testimony and in your oral testimony as well, you highlighted the fiscal gap, the long-term total fiscal liability that we have, and you cite that as over $200 trillion. How have you arrived at that, or how was that arrived at, and what would you suggest in terms of processes that we might look at to address that issue?
Well, it's arrived at through a generational accounting, which is something that Professor Lawrence Kaltikoff is one of the primary proponents of it. And what you're doing is looking at what's been promised versus what we have coming in. So it's a system that looking at right now under current law, what's going to happen. And it just highlights how the health and retirement programs that we put in place have really become unsustainable. And as the longer we wait to address these problems, it gets worse. I have, as Professor Kaltikoff estimated, if we wanted to fix these programs and close the fiscal gap, right now we could either increase all federal taxes by 57%, or we could cut all federal spending by 37%, excluding our ballooning interest payment on the debt. And the longer we wait, the higher these percentages get. So it's something that it needs to take steps right now, not to entirely end these programs, not to immediately close the fiscal gap, but we need a growing realization that passing on these burdens to young people and making it so that they're going to either have to face higher taxes or lower services in the future is something that needs to be addressed and taken seriously. And it's not that we can push these long-term challenges off any longer. We've done that for a while and it hasn't worked. It's only made these programs fail to adjust with the new realities that are facing American seniors.
Yeah, thanks. You talk about raising taxes or lowering spending. We firmly believe that there's another alternative, that is to grow the economy.
Exactly.
Grow the economy, then obviously the increased revenue to the federal government. In fact, there's a slide. I don't know if we have that slide with the growth rates. The growth rates have been projected that over the next 10 years continue to come down. So it was at 3% 3 years ago, 2.9, 2.5, 2.3 over the next 10 years, and that results in trillions, literally trillions of lost money, lost revenue to the federal government just because of the decrease in growth. There's the slide up there. Mr. Baehr, I appreciate your moving rapidly and wanting to move rapidly and break things, and the admonition that you provide for us. I'd be interested in fascinating new inventions that are coming out, and I share your concern about the government getting in the way and halting new innovation, and also share that same concern with the larger challenge that we have, which is to address the automatic spending, the mandatory spending side. So in that first slide that I put up with the Pac-Man, the automatic spending eating up the discretionary spending that we have, which is everything else that people want to do with the federal government, save essentially Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. But we seem to be unable to address that issue. So in the private sector, if you had little control over 2/3 of the spending of your company or whatever it was, what would you do to address that and make certain that that wasn't the case?
Oh, it's a great question. Well, as a co-founder, I get to run this company with my co-founder, Will Davis, and so we have discretion over 100% of the budget. And it's really hard to figure out how we spend it. But I think core to how we run our business is really based on the principles of the lean startup, which is a book that if you guys haven't read it, it's written by Eric Ries, and I included actually a suggested reading list in the back of my testimony. Some of these are a little funnier than others, including The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield, which would be fun if you're running for re-election and having a tough time. It's a good encouragement. But in Eric's book, The Lean Startup, one of the quotes I love, he says, "The only way to win is to learn faster than everyone else." So we really think about the purpose of a startup is to conduct activities to generate novel learnings to test a hypothesis. Now, one of our board members describes it really when you're running a startup, the way to think about it is every morning you want to get up and throw yourself generally in the right direction. And the challenge is to get up faster than the guy next to you. So that might not be the way you're supposed to run government, but the way we think about running a startup is we run lots of little tiny experiments as fast as we can. We try to move fast and break things. So we ship things, meaning ship products, launch websites, run marketing campaigns, et cetera, that honestly we believe probably won't work. But you better bet the very next morning after we've launched that, we're looking at the metrics. We're deciding, did it work? How do we reallocate these funds? So that we're not going 2 weeks of a growth sprint, of a growth cycle, without having some sense of like, did the money we spend on something actually work, or should it be reallocated? It feels a little bit like, to me, the sprint cycle of the federal government might be 10 years. I don't know. So I think one piece of advice, just I'd say humbly, is think about your cycle time of how fast you're shipping new ideas and measuring the results of these little tiny experiments.
Yeah, I think so often we get, Washington measures its success by how much money we put into a system or a program as opposed to whether or not we accomplish the intended purpose, which is oftentimes noble, but we rarely here in Washington check whether or not it's actually working, and that's to the great frustration of so many of us. You, in your testimony, you also include comments that some of your peers have provided, and in just a few short seconds, you want to share some of the comments that folks had about what they might inform us and help us with.
Yeah, well, I mean, we got a lot of funny ones. We got some serious ones. Here's one. So we know there will be a wall of spending coming directly towards America, our unfunded entitlement liabilities. That tsunami will arrive at the expense of today's young Americans and today's startup companies. Like a plague, it will bring no good news, but the young will perish in larger numbers. I think that may have been on a fortune cookie, but sadly, it's pretty right. Let me just share one more briefly. This is from a really amazing leader and innovator who'd come out of the IDEO tradition, which really invented design thinking. It's on the cover of HBR this month, and I'd love to think about how could design thinking speak to what Congress does. But Dave Blanchard is his name, and he writes, "We are in a unique moment in history where entrepreneurs have disproportionate influence on our society. Not only do these visionaries create incredible economic value and countless jobs, they also greatly shape the very cultural foundations of our country. Through the work of their hands, they shape our collective imagination, from what we consume, practice, believe, and desire, to the financing of the social challenges in the nonprofit sector." I just love how Dave thinks about, which I think is really true, and love other people's comments on this, the invitation that we get to have to be entrepreneurs, to co-create, to try something, to get a chance to create a good or service that is going to sit on someone else's kitchen, and that woman who uses this cleaning spray is going to believe and know that her children are safer because of this product they created, that you can do that with a few $1,000s and the creation of a website. It's an amazing thing that America has pulled off, so I'm very thankful to get to be part of that.
Very exciting. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the innovation economy is part of the engine that's moving us forward, and it's an exciting moment for the country. Part of that has been the investment we've made in the past in education, including STEM educations, and I was pleased that the Delegate Blair raise that issue, because I think it's a concern to many of us that you find young Americans moving overseas in STEM fields. One of the reasons for that is that we have dramatically reduced the amount of our national investment in basic research at places like the National Institutes of Health. In fact, if you look at the budget for NIH today, it's 20% lower in real terms than it was in the early 2000s. And Dr. Collins, the head of NIH, says that what keeps them up at night is the fact that he's getting lots of applications, applications for groundbreaking research in medical areas, and he's having to turn down a lot more meritorious proposals today than they did years ago. And every one they turn down may be leaving on the table a treatment or a cure for diseases that plague American families and others around the world. So this goes back to the discretionary budget, and it's absolutely true that the mandatory budget is putting a squeeze on it. I would just point out that the Republican budget that was put forward, this Congress dramatically cut the amount in non-defense discretionary spending, right? They kept the defense spending, discretionary spending, at current levels and grew it, but actually dramatically cut those investments in basic scientific research. And the reality is those investments are things that most American companies cannot engage in because it's so speculative at the very basic research level that historically speaking, they just haven't. So I hope that as we move forward, we won't continue to slash that portion of the budget that we use to make investments, so that those young people who have a great idea in the area of basic scientific research or medical research, when they submit their proposal to the NIH, they're not crowded out by the fact that there are no funds there or because the older scientists are getting most of those grants. So that's a very specific example of why we are, in many cases, losing this sort of race to be at the cutting edge in many of these investments. And interestingly, some of our biggest economic competitors like China, they saw that we had a pretty good model here in the United States for basic research. And so they copied it. And the result is you have a lot of Americans who are migrating overseas in some of those areas. So I would really hope that rather than cutting dramatically that portion of the budget, that discretionary portion of the budget, we make those investments going forward. We've talked about growing the economy, and making those investments is one way to do it. Immigration reform is another. We heard about Social Security. The reality is, according to the Congressional Budget Office, and they're the nonpartisan folks who analyze the impact of certain policy reforms, immigration reform would actually help the solvency of the Social Security system. And I'd be interested, Mr. Baehr, just whether you've had a chance to look at comprehensive immigration reform proposal and where you are on that, because a lot of folks in the innovation community agree that we need to be moving forward in immigration reform. Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I am busy running a company, so don't read congressional reports, I have to be honest. But I will say that several mornings a week, we work with an incredible engineer who's in Sydney, Australia. And in one moment, he would move and join us in Austin if we were able to get him a visa. So that's impacted us personally. I hear from lots of founders across the technology spectrum who want to hire the world's best people, and too often we can't access them. So thank you for raising that.
Right. So I think just of our colleagues that that was part of the overall proposal that was put forward, and we never had a vote on that bill here in the House of Representatives. We'll have to start from scratch, and it doesn't look good in the near term. But I do want to stress that, again, according to the Congressional Budget Office, that would help grow the economy and shore up the solvency of the Social Security system. The last thing I want to go back to, and I want to ask Ms. Vallas her thoughts on this, is that when I put up that chart earlier, I don't have that first chart. I think it's important to understand the difference between raising tax rates and closing tax loopholes. Most economists call tax loopholes expenditures because in many cases what it means is that a particular interest group, because they got the best lobbyist, was able to get themselves a special break, which actually distorts the economy. It distorts a level economic playing field. When a hedge fund manager is able to get a much better tax rate than somebody who's making their living driving a bus or teaching school, it creates a distortion in the economy. And that red bar represents tax breaks tax expenditures according to the Congressional Budget Office. Now, some of these are policies that we may all agree are good ideas, maybe encouraging home ownership. But many are there because you had a powerful special interest. And so for Republican colleagues and to take the position that they are not in favor of eliminating a single tax break for the purpose of reducing the deficit or for the purpose of addressing some of those long-term challenges we're talking about, strikes me as a very lopsided, one-dimensional view of the problem. But that is what we are encountering here right now. So, Ms. Blair, I'm not going to ask you this, but I just ask you to think about whether you would sign a pledge saying, which has been signed by a lot of our colleagues around here, saying that you wouldn't close a single tax break, right, to reduce the deficit or help make sure we can meet some of these commitments we've made over a period of time. Let me just, with Ms. Vallas, if you could talk, you talked about, trying to have an economy that works for more people. If you could just sort of elaborate further on that. I think we all agree that we want more economic growth. Part of that means investing in our future. And some of those investments, and let's be clear, the private sector in America is the driver of the economy, the innovation economy. But we have historically said that some of these investments, like in modernizing our infrastructure, education, basic scientific research, are important drivers of the economy. So if you could just elaborate on that.
Thank you so much for the question, Congressman. So you mentioned that there's a real difference between tax breaks and just raising the tax rate. And just to add a little bit of color to the very important point that you just made, I'll just offer two examples and sort of offer them as comparisons to show where our priorities are currently in our lopsided tax code. At a cost of nearly $60 billion annually, spending on what's called the step-up basis in capital gains, which shields large sums of wealth from taxation when they're passed down to inheritors, that spending on that single policy exceeds by almost $20 billion each year all current spending on our nation's 74 million children through the child tax credit. So just as sort of one comparison, I offer that. A second that I'll offer is the deferral of taxes on foreign corporate income. This is a tax break that has a price tag of $64 billion per year, and it allows multinational corporations to delay paying taxes on their overseas profits. This single policy exceeds our nation's entire spending on the Earned Income Tax Credit, a bipartisan, well-loved policy, which helps more than 26 million working families make ends meet each year. So just two examples of the kinds of tax breaks that half of Congress has declared complete unwillingness to look at and examine. As far as policies that we should be looking at to build an economy that works for millennials, I think we must be looking, as you mentioned, at creating jobs and the investments in infrastructure, in research, in education. Those are all the types of investments that lead to job creation. And we should also be thinking about being careful about unnecessary continued austerity, which, as I mentioned in my opening statement, actually has the counterproductive effect of costing jobs. We need to be looking at policies to boost wages, and top of the agenda for that needs to be raising the federal minimum wage, which, as I mentioned earlier, is lower in real terms today than it was in 1968. That's a huge reason why millennials, who are disproportionately likely to be in minimum wage jobs, are hurting today. And Sarah, I heard you mention that you, or I think I heard in your intro that you wait tables part-time as part of how you're making ends meet in school. The tipped minimum wage is another policy that needs to be taken a look at. It's something that frankly people can't make ends meet on. That's a poverty wage, and that has people relying on public assistance because they can't keep food on their tables at those levels. We also need to be looking at higher education, and I know there are a lot of folks here who share the bipartisan goal of making sure that we have access to affordable higher education. A college education is more important today now than it ever has been for any previous generation, and its CAP has offered a number of policies and proposals targeting that goal, making sure that people actually have access to public college and can afford it, making sure that people can have the burden of student loans eased, and making sure that there are protections in place so that people, so that students don't end up effectively preyed on by for-profit institutions. And President Obama has offered a very important proposed rule called gainful employment that would do a lot to offer those types of protections. So
Gentlemen's
those are
time
just a
has
few
expired.
examples.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you bet. Mr. Rokita is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Meanwhile, back at the hearing entitled Restoring the Trust for All Generations, I had a couple questions I wanted to ask, only after thanking you for your testimony. I want to show you a slide here, slide number 1, the pie chart that I usually refer to. It's usually more colorful than that. It looks a lot like the Pac-Man chart that the chairman referenced. And this basically shows you what's causing our debt, what's driving it. You see that the Pac-Man part of the pie is basically 4 programs: Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, along with the interest we owe ourselves and other countries, and a smorgasbord of other programs in the mandatory spending category. And like you, this is what I'm concerned about. This is why I came to Congress. And unfortunately, like most of your testimony indicated, this is going to fall to you to solve. Now, if we zoom in on that pie chart on the Medicare program, for example, by going to slide 2, we get a little bit more definition on it. And it's basically, I'll show it to you here at least. It's basically a bar graph that shows the delta. What the current, for example, Medicare couple recipient is putting into Medicare versus what they're taking out. And what it comes down to is about, we're in today's recipient generation putting in about 33% of what we're taking out of Medicare, for example. And the rest is going to fall to you. Now, to hear Ms. Vallas' testimony, that's not a big deal, nothing to see here. We can go on. In fact, it'd be detrimental to try to correct some of that. What I'd like to know from the rest of you is what you think about that. But the current recipients of Medicare, for example, but we can also use the Social Security example, or even Medicaid, what you think about what that's doing to you and any ideas you have for solving it. We'll start with you, Delegate Blair.
One idea that I had mentioned in my testimony was a way, just a new, fresh idea that no one's really looked at. It would still have a lot of things that need to be worked out, but would be like reevaluating our current workers' comp system. And this was an example of something that, as a state legislature, we could take the time to implement it, work the things out first. But basically, instead of an employer paying into workers' comp, they would be paying into medical, high-deductible health care for their employees. Their employees would then pay into a 401k medical savings plan, and once they've reached that deductible amount they're paying, they can use that.
I appreciate that. So you're willing to live with a new deal if something was proposed to your generation that would be would allow you to have some of the benefits that Medicare, for example, currently represents, but in a different way, and you had time to plan and prepare for that. That'd be okay with you, right? And we wouldn't even have to affect those that are on or near to be on those programs now. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a cutoff age. I think that, say, maybe 30 would be the one, but to say it's going to be different for you. Somebody's going to get hurt in this, and somebody's going to lose out a little bit, but that's just part of it, and that's the same way we've talked about.
Optimistic so far. Don't start down that
Well,
road.
but no, that's a healthy economy, though. And
Well-
just like we've talked about creating new jobs, unfortunately, with the growth of new jobs means the end of old ones. I mean, I don't know the last time any of you have used a travel agent or a cobbler.
Yeah,
Or
but that's not necessarily a bad thing. And remember, we're not
no,
Greece.
that's a great thing.
Yeah, we're not Greece yet. We still have the luxury to solve these problems now because if we take the action now and have the
Yep.
political will, and that's what I'm really energized by your testimony. Mr. Meyer, in about 30 seconds, can you add to my question?
Yeah, I think over 7 in 10 millennials favor having some sort of private account because the millennials I've talked to, they don't think they're going to get anything back, which isn't true. But they've accepted that, yet they're still paying in
Right.
every single paycheck into these programs, which I find is crazy that they're not outraged, that they think this is just a tax. But I would be hopeful that we could change the discussion so that people don't view these programs, Social Security and Medicare, as entitlements anymore. Let's be honest, they're taking out far more in benefits than they paid in. And Social Security and Medicare have grown drastically from their humble roots when they were created. So we need a changing of an idea, and this isn't even an intergenerational war that's going on. Grandparents, what they care about the most is their grandkids and their well-being. So when they see the charts that are laid out and the numbers and just hear the arguments about how these programs are far different from how they were in the past, they care about fixing them as much as young people do.
Thank you very much, Mr. Meyer. Mr. Baehr, would you mind if I submitted questions to you for response in writing?
Do so for the record. I
Please.
appreciate that.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Thank you. The gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Yarmouth, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all the witnesses. They're all very impressive presentations, and I think I join my colleagues in saying that there is reason for hope. I have a millennial son, and I'm not discouraged at all about what I see on the horizon. I would say one thing to Delegate Blair. If you have people in West Virginia who are leaving the country because they can't find STEM jobs, I would invite them to come to my district, because every day I talk to business leaders there who say, if I could find 10 people with backgrounds, I'd hire them. If I could find 20, I'd hire them. If I could find 50, I would hire them. As a matter of fact, just Googling here, there was a U.S. News Report story that talked about almost 6 million STEM field jobs open in the United States. So I think there are plenty of opportunities here. And again, we'd be happy to have all of our neighbors from West Virginia come to Kentucky and take some of those jobs. While we're talking about Social Security, I know that, for instance, Mr. Baehr, if you're self-employed, you're paying 15%, or not, well, 12.5% on Social Security, another 1.5% for, 13.5%, another 1.5%. So you're paying 15% if you're self-employed to Social Security and Medicare taxes. And I know, Delegate Blair, you talked about many of your colleagues, your contemporaries, who are paying a very large percentage of their income. In sustaining the Social Security system, do you think then it's fair that my college classmate, Stephen Schwarzman, who's head of the Blackstone Group, featured in the New York Times this week, makes $690 million last year and paid Social Security taxes on the first $110,000? Do you think that that's a fair and equitable tax burden for him to shoulder? I'll put it to anybody. Anybody think it's fair?
Well, I think if we do need an adjustment to benefits and to Social Security's financing to keep it going, but I think something that would be better was, let's say your colleague, he doesn't need Social Security when he retires. So I would be much more in favor, and I think it would be smarter economic policy to index benefit, or to change benefits with the wealth you have when you're retired and your income that you're gaining from that. And I think that's an opening a conversation that people should be open to, because it's something like Oprah or Donald Trump, when they retire, they're not going to need Social Security. If we care about these programs, which should be to protect people with low incomes, not just because you're elderly, it makes no sense anymore with the changing in health outcomes and the changing in wealth distribution to give money to people just because they're elderly, especially when what they've paid into the program isn't even close to what
we do tax them at a higher rate, but that doesn't do anything to shore up the system. All that does is take their individual burden. I mean, there are very, very few of those people. But I think the point is worth stating that, Blackstone Group in another area, we're talking about tax benefits, said they made $4 billion in profit last year and paid a 4.3% tax rate. Another area in which, when we talk about what we do to sustain our long-term budgetary challenge, or to deal with our long-term budgetary challenges, that we don't rely just on spending, because there are these inequities that exist in the tax code which are allowing people to accumulate enormous sums of wealth and increase the disparity, making it harder for all of these other programs to be sustained. Ms. Ballas, I want to just get to one thing. We've talked a lot about education here, and would you, in the last minute and a half, talk about what the challenges to education, the way the Republican budget, for instance, cuts funding for higher education and Pell Grants and so forth, what that does to the future prospects of the millennials?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. As has been mentioned a couple of times today, the FY16 congressional budget is really sort of the opposite of what millennials need in that it slashes vital investments such as in education, when what we need to be doing is making those investments and creating pathways to good jobs for young Americans. The Pell Grant has actually eroded tremendously in its purchasing power. This is something I think that bears repeating with numbers. In 1975, the Pell Grant was able to cover 67% of average college costs. Today, it's actually reduced down to a quarter. That's a huge piece of what's going on in terms of access to affordable education. Meanwhile, we've also seen massive disinvestment by states in their public education at the higher education level, and as a result, now colleges are relying more on tuition revenue than they are on state investments, and that means it's shifted the cost burden over to students. Those are major reasons why we're seeing the crushing levels of student debt that students today are facing, and unfortunately, the FY16 budget would be a step in the wrong direction.
Thank you. Once again, thanks to all the witnesses.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you all being here. I'm inspired by each of you. Ms. Vallas, I didn't agree with as much of your testimony as I did some of the others, but I'm still inspired by the opportunity. I was not expecting Mr. Baehr to hear the Postal Service and our senior Republican senator criticized in the same sentence. You had to really work hard to make that happen.
Congressman, it may have been a run-on. My apologies.
There was a sentence in Ms. Vallas's written testimony that says this. It said, indeed, a 1935 article in Time magazine summarizing Republicans' opposition to Social Security sounds a lot like the scare tactics of some are peddling to millennials today. Quoting the Time magazine article from 1935, wage earners, you will pay and pay in taxes, and when you are very old, you will have an IOU which the U.S. government may make good on if it is still solvent. That was the scare tactic in 1935, and it's true as we sit here today. The tax rate that we promised folks in 1935 was 1% tax on your first $3,000 in wages. Today, that tax hasn't doubled, it hasn't tripled, it hasn't quadrupled, it hasn't quintupled, it's sextupled today. The inflation-adjusted value of the $3,000 we told you we would tax in 1935 today is under $50,000, and yet the amount we tax is over $100,000 today. Those promises of 1935 are exactly true today, and the Social Security actuaries tell us that if we don't raise taxes more or cut benefits more, then we'll only have enough money to pay 75% of the value of benefits when my generation retires, much less yours. I can't go fast and break things when the largest tax that 80% of Americans pay is their Social Security tax. Mr. Meyer was ready to start means testing those benefits, and it's strange to me if you talk to my Republican colleagues, we're with you on means testing, we won't raise taxes. We'll take $100 from a rich person in benefits, but we won't tax a rich person $100 in the name of tax reform. It's a mystery to me. I don't understand how we've ended up in that box. But when it comes to trust, restoring the trust, income taxes are what's supposed to pay for the investment. I agree with Ms. Vallas that we're erring when we reduce our investment. But I disagree with Mr. Meyer when he says that the Social Security tax is the way, because that feels to me in my generation like more of a quid pro quo. I gave you this money, you promised you were going to give it back to me in some form, so I want that back. My grandfather didn't need it, but he wanted it because it was a promise. We're talking about trust today. Is it equivalent for you all, the taxes you pay on your income side versus the taxes you pay on the payroll side, because it's all going into the same pot anyway, and nobody believes these programs are going to survive? I'll start with you, Mr. Meyer, because you quoted my favorite economist, my favorite liberal economist in Dr. Kotlikov, and I want to find out why means testing on payroll taxes rather than income taxes would be where you begin.
I think it's because when we look at in terms of restoring the trust, due to a series of errors, there's been botched promises, unfunded promises made to Americans saying that if you pay in this, you're going to get back the amount you paid in, here's what we promised, and it's going to have interest, it's going to help you get a secure retirement. But just how Social Security is structured, it's not going to produce the returns that we need, especially when you have more and more people retiring, which, that's a great thing. More people living longer, this is all great. But you can't expect 2 or 3 workers to support every single retiree. I have some numbers. Back when Social Security began in 1937, once it started in, it had just over 50,000 beneficiaries who received a total of just $22 million in today's dollars. But now we have over 59 million beneficiaries, over 1,000 times more than in 1937, and it costs nearly 40,000 times what it cost back then. So this program has drastically changed and become an idea that you get money just because you're old. I mean, we're going to have broken promises. We're paying in, and we're not going to get back what we're paying in. Even people, a lot of people in the younger end of the boomer generation, they're going to get the same raw deal. So I think it's about time that we stop giving people money just because they're just because they're elderly, and instead look at if what we care about is elderly poverty. Let's worry about poverty in general and people who aren't earning enough income and not give it back. We need to end the false idea that this is an entitlement, and especially on the side of Medicare, what you paid in, you're getting back, and you've paid for all this.
I thank you. I thank you all for being here. I look forward to sharing your testimony with folks back home in Georgia.
The gentleman's time has expired. Thank you. Gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Moulton, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I believe I'm the youngest member of this committee, so with that, I'd particularly like to welcome you all here. And I'd especially like to welcome my friend Evan Baehr. We were classmates at business school, and I'm delighted at your success, and I really appreciate your being here to testify this morning. Evan and I come from fairly different places on the political spectrum, and yet I think that one hallmark of millennials is we try to find places where we can agree, that there's been too much partisanship in Washington, and that prevents progress. And one of the issues I wanted to hone in on, which is a broader issue facing the Congress, but absolutely a budgetary issue as well, is comprehensive immigration reform. And Evan, in your testimony that you presented, there was a quote from someone in the Millennial Voices section of your Able Lending document. Comprehensive immigration reform is critical to building our economy and remaining globally competitive. We want to encourage the best and the brightest to come to this country. I immigrated to the United States as a young boy from the former Soviet Union and used that opportunity to graduate from college and build a successful company. I'm living proof of the American dream, and I believe that expanding that opportunity will only make our country greater. And I'd just love to hear from, I know, Evan, you spoke to this a bit already, but I'd love to hear from the other panelists how you feel about comprehensive immigration reform. It's an issue that's widely supported by millennials. Polls show it's also something that will cut the federal deficit by over $1 trillion as estimated by the Congressional Budget Office. So Delegate Blair, perhaps we could start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think it is something that needs to be touched on. I don't necessarily think that it's matching everything that we're prepared to talk about today. I do think that it needs to be looked at in a lot of ways. I think we're doing it better than they are, say, in Europe right now.
Where just speaking as a millennial, is it something that you support? Do you support comprehensive immigration reform?
I do, but I don't think it's a #1 priority for us right now. I think we need to be focusing on other things right now.
Mr. Meyer, how do you feel about comprehensive immigration reform?
I think it's a major priority that should get support from both sides of the aisle. There's a lot of differences on the details, but I think both sides want more immigrants coming in, both high-skilled and low-skilled immigrants. And if you look at, especially in terms of tying it into this hearing, getting more workers who are immigrants tend to be much younger than native-born Americans, and the way that they pay in, it's uncontroversial that they help the funding problems with the current health and retirement benefits program. So just limiting it to that, I think it's a policy that needs to be looked at so we can get more workers to support our growing roles of retirees. But also I think in terms of economic growth, which is so critical to closing the fiscal gap in our current budget shortfall, increased immigration would help go a long way to fixing that.
Thank you. And Ms. Vallas, if you'd like to add.
I'm loving the bipartisan agreement here, right? I think we found the issue. I heard Saira mention earlier that her favorite calculator is the debt calculator. Well, one of my favorite calculators is actually the Center for American Progress Comprehensive Immigration Reform Calculator, which is actually, it shows you on an updated basis exactly how much we're costing our economy by delaying and failing to enact comprehensive immigration reform. And it would also have a tremendously positive impact on Social Security Security and Medicare, in addition to broader deficit reduction. A CAP analysis just a couple of years ago found that enabling undocumented immigrants to come out of the shadows and earn citizenship would boost the Social Security trust funds by more than $500 billion on a net basis over the next 36 years, and also add hundreds of billions of dollars to the Medicare trust fund in the coming decades as well.
Another issue that I think is bipartisan for many millennials is entrepreneurship. Indeed, that's why many of you are here, and investing in tech, also investing in clean energy. And Delegate Blair, you mentioned how some of your colleagues are finding it difficult to start companies in clean energy because folks are unwilling to move off of coal. And I wanted to know if you think that the subsidies the federal government provides for fossil fuels like coal are part of the problem. Usually, there are a lot of sectors where the government incentivizes investment in things like clean tech. In the case of the energy economy, we really subsidize investment in fossil fuels. Do you think that's part of the issue here?
The issue isn't they're stuck on being coal, not the millennials, not my generation. It was actually what Mr. Van Hollen brought up earlier, which was not enough funding into those areas, which...
So you don't think that the subsidies the government provides for continued investment in coal affect the ability of millennial entrepreneurs to get clean energy companies off the ground?
I think the fact that our discretionary budget isn't big enough for both of them is the problem. I think if we had less mandatory spending and there was a little bit more room, because 20 years
Do you
ago...
think we should continue subsidies for fossil fuels? Yes or no?
Yes, because it's what keeping the lights on right now until tomorrow.
Thank you very much.
Gentleman's time has expired. And I would once again just remind folks that this is not a policy discussion about energy policy and the like. What we're trying to do is to talk about the big challenge that we face from a spending standpoint, especially on the mandatory side, and how we as a Congress in a bipartisan way might address that. Mr. Rice is recognized for 5 minutes.
Yeah, I've listened to all of you very intently, and I have 3 sons, and they're all between 25 and 30 years old, so I think they're in the same place as you or close to you, and I've seen what they've had to go through since they graduated from college, and I think it is not good. I mean, America used to be called a land of opportunity, and I'm not sure we have the same level of opportunity that we've had. When I came out of college, I hear you talking about people leaving West Virginia and the country. I've personally seen it in South Carolina, so I know exactly what you're talking about. I'll start with you, Mr. Baehr. You talked about the struggles that you face in forming a business and the federal regulatory structure. And the regulatory structure under the president, I saw a study last week that in 6.5 years he's put in more regulations than any president since Franklin Roosevelt. How would you rank his regulatory structure's effect on the economy? Is it A for excellent or F for horrible or somewhere in between?
Well, thank you for the question. I just defer to the World Bank, a wonderful research house. It says the U.S. currently has fallen to number 46 in the world as a nation for places that are effective to build a business.
Mr. Meyer, how would you rank it?
Well, unfortunately, regulatory accumulation hasn't been a partisan issue. Both sides of the aisle in the past have continued to add to Washington's regulatory reach. If we look right now, we have over 1 million commandments in the Code of Federal Regulations. These are times that words such as shall, must, or cannot are used in the Code of Federal Regulations. So if we want to grow the economy to get out of this fiscal gap.
Have you looked at Dodd-Frank in particular?
I know the Mercatus Center at George Mason University has looked through Dodd-Frank, and they've looked by agency and what sectors.
Do you think that has a stifling effect on small business and millennials in particular?
Yeah, and I would say one thing that was positive.
Very limited time. So
yes, the Jumpstart a Small Business Act, Jobs Act, which still hasn't been fully implemented, would go a long way towards helping some of the.
And Mrs. Blair, do you think that regulatory mushrooming and Dodd-Frank in particular has a stifling effect on opportunity for millennials?
Yes, sir, absolutely.
Thank you. I want to ask you about these pressing problems that we're all talking about: tax expenditures, tax reform. The president talks about the need for tax reform. We talk about it here in the House, and the Senate does the same thing. Have you seen the president's comprehensive tax reform package, Mrs. Vallas? And what can you critique it? What have you looked at his tax reform package?
So what I will say in an interest...
Have you seen his tax reform package?
I have not sat down and studied it
because he doesn't have one.
extensively.
That's why I haven't seen it.
Right.
He talks about the need for it, but you see no proposals on it. How would you rate, let's see, the president's proposal to fix our national debt? I've heard at least 3 of the 4 of you talk about the crushing blow that this national debt places on the shoulders of millennials. The president's budget that he produced for the next 10 years never balances. In fact, it adds about $2 trillion to the debt. How would you rate his proposal to bring our debt into balance and to start relieving this crushing blow that's placed on millennials, Mr. Baehr? How would you rank his budget, A or F, or somewhere in between?
I mean, honestly, I spend my day trying to be responsible to my investors, building a business.
I hear an F coming out of you. Mr. Meyer, how would you rank it?
I would say any budget that doesn't address the mandatory spending constraints that are being put on our economy is not a budget that's going to lead to
Thank
prosperity.
you. I hear an F coming out of you, Mrs. Blair.
I don't think this is an A or F. I think it's a pass or fail, and I think it's fail.
Okay. How would you, we're talking about Social Security in particular and the fact that millennials don't think they'll ever get it. How would you rank, have you seen the specific proposals that the president has put forth to fix the Social Security system? A comprehensive plan to fix it?
No,
I hadn't
sir.
either because there isn't one. Mr. Meyer, how would you rank the president's performance in terms of trying to fix Social Security?
I think it's more of almost putting your head in the sand, saying that this isn't a problem and it's something that's just a temporary imbalance as more people are retiring rather than looking at the long-term picture. And
Okay, I'm sorry. And Mrs. Vallas, you get 10 seconds.
Well, I like Reagan's plan, which was to put the payroll
Okay,
tax
good.
cap
I do
at
too.
90%.
Mr. Baehr, how would you rank the
Covered
president's
wages.
proposal?
I defer to the experts on the panel.
All right, so here's what I want to sum up with. Things that y'all are talking about is these critical issues: tax reform, Social Security reform, deficit reduction. You see really no comprehensive plan coming from the president at all. He talks about it all the time, nothing in terms of specifics. But yet, he spends months trying to sell a plan to get nuclear weapons to Iran. Where are his priorities? Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pascrell, is recognized for 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's always a pleasure. And, Mr. Chairman, I think you'd agree the future is bright. These 4 folks are hope. So when folks on either side of the aisle get down on what's going to happen 5 years from now, 5 minutes from now, 10 years from now, our young people, I have confidence in them. I think they have the ability to reconcile, which we don't. In 2013, Mr. Chairman, the federal government spent, through the tax code, more than $500 billion on asset-building programs, promoting home ownership, retirement savings, and higher education. Yet, the top 0.1% of households received an average benefit of $33,391. The bottom 20% received just $77. You cannot deny this. Households in the top 20% receive about 70 times as much support from these programs as do households in the bottom 20%. So you need to define what redistribution means, because I don't think it's been defined properly. Why do these provisions receive far less scrutiny? Could it be because we in Congress care more about the wealthy or the well-off than we do about those who rely on Social Security and Medicare? And how many people today are relying totally on Social Security in the retirement years? Do we owe a greater debt to an oil company or to a senior citizen who's worked all their lives and paid into the system? So I agree, we are shortchanging our young people, we're shortchanging our seniors, we are shortchanging our future prosperity, and this is certainly a moral issue to me. Pope Francis is going to be visiting us in a few days. In 2013, Pope Francis wrote the following, quote, "While the earnings of a minority are growing exponentially, so too is the gap separating the majority from the prosperity enjoyed by those happy few. This imbalance is the result of ideologies which defend the absolute autonomy of the marketplace and financial speculation. Meanwhile, the excluded are still waiting. And, Mr. Chairman, you look at the numbers, this Congress has passed $611 billion in unpaid-for permanent tax cuts. Whether you're talking about the total permanent extensions of the expired provisions, or whether you're talking about other tax cuts, $611 billion. Don't talk to me about debt. You did it. You're contributing to it. Certainly, we contributed too. This is us. We're in one boat. Retirement security in America has traditionally been thought of as a three-legged stool consisting of Social Security, employer pensions, and personal savings and investment. The first leg, Social Security, guarantees a modest but stable stable income in retirement. Today, for too many Americans, it is the only leg left to stand. Half of the U.S. workers are covered by defined contribution plans, which are subject to the fluctuations of the market. About 1/3 of Americans aged 45 to 64 have nothing saved for retirement at all. Zero. For all these reasons, Social Security and Medicare must be strengthened, not weakened. This social insurance program doesn't just provide for financial support. It ensures that middle-class Americans can retire with dignity. The modest benefits provide more than half of the income of the majority of recipients. They also lift more than 22 million Americans out of poverty. Congressman Larson has a bill I've co-sponsored that would strengthen Social Security benefits for current and future beneficiaries. I agree that we face a moral dilemma, but instead of focusing on slashing social insurance, we should focus on the waste in our largest area of spending, the more than $1 trillion of spending hidden in the federal tax code itself. We publicly subsidize
Gentleman's time.
Now, just finish my sentence.
How short's the sentence?
22 words.
Go.
That's a good question. We publicly subsidize $12 billion annually just for corporate meals and entertainment. We provide $4 billion a year to subsidize oil drilling through tax breaks. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your courtesy.
Those two sentences, by the way.
Well, I combined them.
Gentlemen, thank you. Thank you. Mr. Cole from Oklahoma, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to make a quick corrective point to my friend, Mr. Van Hollen, who I regret is not here, and then I want to turn to the witnesses. But actually, the Republican Appropriations Committee spends more money on the NIH than the president actually asked for this year. The Republican Senate actually spends yet more money than we do, or has requested more. And the last time the NIH was really appropriately funded was when, under Newt Gingrich and John Porter, they doubled the budget for the NIH, Republicans, while they were actually balancing the budget. So pretty remarkable achievement, but national funding hasn't been, quote, slashed by Republicans for basic research. Anyway, I actually want to now turn to all four of you, and I'm going to begin with you, Ms. Blair, and just ask you to work down the line. We have a new president in 18 months. That new president will walk in when the deficit has been declining for a number of years, but our own CBO tells us that that's going to reverse just about the moment that president, whoever it is, comes in the doors. A deficit's going to begin to go back up because of snowballing entitlement spending. So that president probably going to have to do something within the first term, literally, or try to run for re-election with a rising deficit, something I think they wouldn't do. So if you had an opportunity to talk directly to the next president of the United States, what would you tell them they should do? What specific policies should they enact to deal with the budget situation that they're going to confront?
Yeah, my biggest thing, I would say, not to be afraid necessarily of re-election, and I face it just the same as everybody else in this room, that you're afraid of enacting a certain policy because of what the numbers will be in November when you're being elected. But we can't be worried about that right now. And I mean, it might have to break a couple hearts, but my generation, I personally, with Social Security is the biggest one, reforming it. I mean, you need to keep the promise to, say, my parents, but to my generation, I think we would be more accepting with slashing the program if that even was a possibility, or really changing it. And yeah, it's going to bother some of the younger Americans because we're going to be paying into it, or we create a whole new program, but something big needs to happen. And I think the biggest thing is not to be afraid of the results that could happen from it.
Okay, Mr. Meyer?
I would say they need to look long and hard at what's coming down the road. In 2050, when people born today are going to be working, when they're going to be working their way up the career ladder, they're going to be paying almost a third of their hard-earned incomes just in the payroll tax. Is that the kind of America that president wants to pass down to future Americans? So I think what they need to look at is a question of cutting home your take-home pay before all other federal taxes, all state taxes, property taxes, everything else. You're losing a third of your income. That's something that I don't think Americans are going to be okay with, and the sooner that they've started to wake up to the reality that our health and retirement benefit programs are broken, and now they're waiting for more people in Washington to be able to get the political capital to push these needed reforms through.
Okay, Ms. Vallas?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Historic levels of income inequality pose arguably the greatest threat to our economy of anything right now. And as a result, I would advise that new president to take stock of the fact that income inequality slows income growth not only at the bottom, but also dampens economic growth writ large. And as we have a shared priority of not only restoring the trust for millennials, but also enacting policies that are going to ensure economic growth at the levels we'd like to see, I would recommend an agenda that includes creating good jobs and pathways to good jobs, boosting wages, such as through raising the minimum wage, ensuring an adequate social insurance system, work-family policies, such as paid leave. We're the only developed nation that does not have paid leave, and as we've discussed extensively today, ensuring access to higher education.
Right. Mr. Baehr?
I have three maybe more non-traditional ones. First, once a week I'd send the White House staff out of the West Wing, out of the EEOB to work with accelerators, incubators, co-working spaces. We need to be around the people that are creating things, remember how that works. Number two, Reagan said personnel is policy. I want this next president to have binders of millennials. We should have at least 50% of the next White House staff be under the age of 35. And last, I think he or she should set up a Periscope account. It's a great way to be honest and transparent with people about what you're doing, who you're meeting with, who you're talking to. It's a great way to get feedback.
Well, I just have a few seconds left, but in closing, let me just commend all of you. One of my great complaints at town hall meetings is nobody asks me about Social Security unless they're over 60 years old. And the people that need to be the most concerned are indeed your generation. So thanks for coming here and sharing some really thoughtful ideas with us today. Yield back, Mr.
Thank you, gentlemen. Dr. McDermott is recognized for 5 minutes.
Hey, to the machine. I represent a university, so I listen to students all the time. And I heard a little bit about student debt here. And it seems to me that's the biggest issue that faces the millennials. Maybe some of the people up here testifying aren't worried about it, but most students are because they know they can't get on with their lives. Now, I introduced a bill called the Fairness in Student Loan Lending that would allow students to refinance their loans. Why is it that students can't refinance their loan, but I can refinance my loan on my house? Well, it's because of laws here. No Republican would sign that bill. No Republican cares about students refinancing their loans. Okay? I also offered a bill that would allow students not to pay a huge tax if they paid off their loans early. Again, students work and pay it off quickly. They wind up with a big tax because the company gave them some kind of assistance in doing that. That bill has no Republican signatures. Now, it's hard for me to understand how you could come up here and talk about that and not find fault with the people, or at least ask the question. But I read your testimonies very carefully because I think you really are the key to this election. Obama turned everybody out in 2008, and if people don't come out in 2016, we may get Donald Trump for president. I wouldn't be the least bit surprised. But when I read these suggestions, I love this one from West Virginia. We would eliminate our current workers' comp program. Now, I don't know where that idea came from or who thought it up, but it is about the most ahistorical suggestion I've ever seen. Workers' comp was put in this country in 1910 by a Republican by the name of Theodore Roosevelt, because in those days when a miner got hurt in West Virginia, he was thrown out in the street and they got another miner to put in his place, and there was no compensation. Nobody paid for their health care. Nobody paid for the injury. If the mine company was wrong, they were just out in the street. And we also discovered that in all these years of working in the mines, you breathe a lot of dust. It's something called black lung disease. There's a big part of our budget it's guaranteed to miners who have black lung disease. Now, I don't know if this idea, it was coupled with the employers must give health care to their employees. That sounds like an employer mandate. That's what the Republicans have spent the last, well, ever since it passed in 2010, trying to kill Obamacare, which has an employer mandate in it. I find it very hard to understand how you can talk about an employer mandate at the same time take it away. Oh, but they do. They have a solution to that. The money that the employee pays for health insurance will mandatorily be put into a 401k plan. Now, there's a good say. That's a good pension plan for the future. Anybody looking at their 401k is worried about what's happening to it. The only thing anybody knows in West Virginia or Illinois or Washington State or anywhere else is their Social Security will be there. And it's going to be there. There's money to 2075, which all of you and all the millennials will be around to take advantage of. And the fact is that I don't understand how do they take seriously your idea of getting rid of the workers' comp plan in West Virginia?
If you would like a complete definitive plan, since you don't understand, I do have one here.
Well, that's what you
and I
told
would
here.
be more than happy to give it to you. But no, it's not just getting rid of workers' comp, and I mean, you did simplify it, yes, but it's creating self-responsibility, which is, and yes, we do have minors, but we also have OSHA and a lot of other things that come in.
Let me stop you for a second, because what I wondered about was, how do you take care of the company's responsibility for mine safety? Because workers' comp says if there's problems, the mine has to pay everything and they have to pay for what they've done. I don't understand. Do you let the mine companies off?
Gentleman's time has expired. You're welcome to respond briefly if you'd like.
Mine is actually a very safe industry now. You're far more likely to be in danger working as a garbage truck driver. And this is really applying to taking responsibility into when you're carrying something at FedEx, you're going to pick up that box, you're going to bend your knees, and you're not going to throw out your back to take workers' comp for it because it's coming out of your own savings plan. It's really just reinforcing self-responsibility.
Thank you. Ms. Black from Tennessee is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate so much your having this hearing of restoring the trust for the younger generation, and I'm really interested in hearing what you all have to say. I appreciate your written comments and your opening statements, and I've learned so much just from listening to you. This generation I'm excited about the ideas and the creativity and the initiatives that you all have. I must say that a couple of comments were made that will show my age. I still do use a cobbler. I don't have time for getting on the internet and understanding the travel, so I use an agent, and I called Facebook, and my grandchildren quickly told me it's not the Facebook, Mimi, it's Facebook. So I do feel a little old when I am with you all, but I'm energized. I truly mean that I think that our country will be in great shape with having you all as leaders. What I want to go to is the idea of the jobs, and you all did talk a little bit about jobs. Our economy has been growing by 2% or less over the last 6 years, And what I'm hearing most from young people in my district is finding a good job, finding good work. Evan, I know that you have a lot of creativity and have reached out with using your own creativity and creating jobs. But jobs really are the best opportunity for success and for having the American dream. As a matter of fact, Pope Francis was referenced here, and I want to just read a quote from Pope Francis out of this book that is called The Conservative Heart by Author Books. And since he is coming, I think this is worth noting that Pope Francis noted that the youth unemployment rate in Europe recently asked his fellow European bishops this: what are we doing for young people? Giving them something to eat? Yes, that's a fine thing. But that doesn't give them dignity to a young person. Dignity comes from work. And so I want to ask each of you, do you believe that is what your younger generation believes? I know that the representative, you talked about this generation getting a lot of things, and they are maybe coddled a little bit in that nature of what they're given by their parents. But do you believe that work really is your generation's idea of what creates dignity? Evan, why don't I start with you?
Well, thank you for referencing the Pope. I think there's a wonderful narrative here in Western literature and biblical tradition about humans are co-creators. We were given an amazing sense of creativity and an invitation to build and destroy and to paint and to hire and to fire and to ship products that can transform the world. So I can just speak personally and say, I can't imagine a better job in the world than what I get to do every day. And if my company doesn't work and it all goes away, we'll be on to some other venture and we'll love that venture. I'll say we get to work with a lot of small business owners that we fund, and they are passionate about creating their own products and they want to create jobs. And what we hear from them is the banks that they used to go to 20 years ago that would fund them and enable them to grow are no longer able to fund them. And it's a complicated issue, but there are people in this town that have done things that have resulted in great people that want to build great companies that hire people can't do so as easily as they used to.
How about you, Sarah? Do you believe that work is a big part of the dignity that someone would have, and that we need to create an economy where there can be work for these young millennials?
Absolutely, and I don't think it's just the dignity either. I think working creates happiness. A lot of people would argue, oh no, I hate it, but it makes you appreciate the time that you're not working, and it gives you a sense of purpose, and it makes you feel like you belong and you are part of the economy.
How about you, Jared?
Well, I would say millennials have a different idea of work, and this is what I've gathered from talking to the hundreds of millennials I spoke with when researching for my book. But instead of a job where they go in and work for 40 years, then collect their pension and are retired and done, then millennials really want to embody their work, and they search for something that really gives them meaning and that they have flexibility. And as Evan brought up earlier, a lot of them want to start their own business. 2/3 want to end up being their own boss at some point. So right now we have labor market policies that are stuck in really a 20th century business model where we're making it harder for people to be independent contractors, work for their own, and we're putting more stringent restrictions rather than freeing millennials.
Would you say that we need to get government out of the way so jobs can be created and we can find the economy growing and jobs produced?
In quite a few ways, and I would say definitely some recent Labor Department actions have contributed to that, along with on the state level and local level, occupational licensing is something that makes it very difficult for young people to get into the workforce.
Rebecca, real fast, work create dignity?
Yes, and I think it's important that the jobs that we're creating be ones that pay a living wage. I think that dignity requires that a person who's going to work and working incredibly hard full-time not live in poverty.
And reclaiming my time, I know I'm
has
out of
expired.
time.
Thank you. Ms. Lee from California, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me first thank all of you for being here. I'm very proud of each and every one of you, and I think all of you do reflect the future. Just following up on the issue as it relates to jobs, many of us believe the government has a responsibility first to invest in policies that provide for the opportunity to create jobs, and secondly, when there's a recession or when people can't find jobs, and there are a variety of reasons why they can't find jobs, that we have a responsibility to provide for the safety net. And I wanted to ask you just a couple of questions. One is in terms of what this Congress has done. We passed over $611 billion in unpaid for permanent tax cuts, which quite frankly benefit not necessarily millennials, or young people, but benefit the very wealthy. And those tax cuts impact the deficit in terms of creating more of a deficit. However, I think you will, and you know that creating jobs also helps to reduce the deficit. And so what is your take on supporting, for instance, no cuts to the safety net until people can find a job? Secondly, increasing a minimum wage. I formerly was on public assistance, food stamps, but also a business owner for 11 years, 350 employees. Had it not been for the safety net that got me through some very difficult times, I never would have been able to establish a business, employ people, create jobs, and send my kids to college. And it was a safety net that during hard times that gave me that opportunity. So those investments in job creation and minimizing cuts to the safety net, for some of us, make a lot of sense. So I wanted to ask you your take on that. Secondly, as it relates to young people of color, race is still a factor. How do you see the whole issue around economic opportunity, job creation, and the issues as it relates to Black Lives Matter? And what would your take be on that? Because we don't have any panelists who could kind of give us a sense of African American and Latino and Asian Pacific American young people's perspective on the economy and on jobs.
Well, just a quick comment on that. First, thank you for building a business. I didn't know that about your background. Getting to 350 employees is a huge accomplishment, and thank you for creating those jobs and caring for those people. I wish that more members of Congress had been entrepreneurs before than lawyers. We've got a bunch of lawyers. I think the question is, we all love a safety net. We all love the idea that in tough times, there's someone there to care for you. The fundamental question is, who's going to do that? 150 years ago, Tocqueville commented on the amazing tradition of civil society we have in the United States, of people bonding together in Rotary clubs and churches and synagogues that would work together to care for their neighbor. Now, it's not fair to say that we should expect civil society to deliver all the benefit, all the necessary goods and services that we need as part of this social net. But to me, that's really the core question, is we both want the same thing. We want the social safety net. The question is, who's going to deliver it?
Since our time is short, could someone comment on Black Lives Matter and African American young people and young people of color, and what your take is on their perspective on the country at this point in terms of the economy?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I'm very proud of in my generation is that I would say that we are very bonded together. We come together as one unit, millennials, young people together. We really don't see race, gender, or sexuality, no matter what side of the party you're on, that's not really as much of a factor. And so I think that's encouraging that I got home from a big startup program with, it was some of the greatest new companies coming out of the US in Austin, Texas. They were holding a big event, and everybody collectively came together regardless of race or gender or sexuality to create these ideas and to constantly throw in and to speak about the ideas.
So is race a factor at all?
Congresswoman, if I could
think
add
so.
to that, I think as we talk about Black Lives Matter and the economic aspect that really must be a piece of that, one of the major legacies of mass incarceration in this country is that we now have 1 in 3 Americans living with some type of criminal record. That is how many people we have arrested and locked up over all of the years. And there are tremendous barriers to opportunity that go along with having a criminal history. If we're all here trying to agree we want to be removing barriers to opportunity for young Americans, we need to, I would hope, find some bipartisan agreement around a second chance as well.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Sanford, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks, sir. There we are. I guess I begin with you, Evan. I want to go back to what you said about, I think your attitude was move fast and break things, or on occasion move fast and break things, or move faster and break things, something along those lines. And during the August recess, I was with a group of seniors at Sun City in Bluffton, South Carolina, and they were singing Donald Trump's praises. Not necessarily that they completely agreed with him philosophically, not necessarily that they thought he necessarily had the right temperament to be close to a nuclear bomb, or at least the ability to push buttons on that front. They had a number of different sort of caveats with regard to their endorsement of his candidacy. But at the end of the day, they said, look, we want to send a message that we want somebody to go to Washington who at least break a bit of China. And we think that he might do that, and accordingly, we're sympathetic to his campaign. And so I want to go back to move fast and break things. Particularly for any of y'all as millennials, and what would you say when you look at Washington in changing the culture so that it might move just a little bit faster? Are there two lessons learned perhaps from the private sector that you've observed when you say, yeah, you guys ought to think about this in terms of messaging your ideas, or you ought to think about this in terms of process?
Well, I think you do have to be careful with the message of move fast and break things. When said to seniors, if they move fast, they may break things. So you got to be careful about that one. Two quick thoughts. Broadly, the concept of design thinking, I think, is the core linchpin for how organizations and people can start to move faster and break things. One principle of that is user-centered design. Sounds fancy. It really just means getting to know and spending time with the people that you're actually serving. A lot of people in DC probably don't get to spend a lot of time with constituents or people that are receiving the services. The second thing I'd say is prototype. I get it that it's controversial to publish something and to put forward a policy that a few months or years later may get destroyed, but that's the strategy that all startups employ. We ship something knowing that we ship it to learn, we collect evidence on it, and then we change it. Two quick ideas.
Erskine Bowles, who was, I guess, Clinton's chief of staff when he was president, later in the the Bowles-Simpson Commission said that, what we're looking at is the most predictable financial crisis in the history of man. And yet it's not breaking through. If you look at voter participation numbers and all those sorts of things with young people, it's not breaking through. Are there two ideas or one idea that any one of you all might throw out in terms of those of us involved in the political process, making it more real to young people how real this problem is that's coming their way?
Yeah, I think pointing out the amount of their paychecks that they're going to be losing and showing that right now, even though they see they're losing 15% of their paychecks with the employer-employee contributions, it's going to get worse. They're going to have to keep paying into these programs. And what's surprising is, as I said earlier, they don't think they'll ever even get anything back, which isn't true. But they've almost given up on this point. So that's why I applaud the idea of this committee coming together to try to make this an issue that we can talk about and that people start to worry about. Because I said it shouldn't be a generational issue. Older Americans care just as much.
Everybody's got 15 seconds or less because I'm watching
sorry.
my clock. Go.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll keep mine short. One of the biggest things that I hate to use, but they're the most effective, is ultimatums. If they don't do something now, then there's inevitably going to be a problem. And really getting the point that it's now or never and that they have to get out here.
Thank you for the question. I would urge us to remember Bowles-Simpson and to take a look at actually what its recommendations were for some of the flawed policies that it might have put forth. It recommended $1.7 trillion in discretionary spending cuts between FY11 and FY 2020, and compared with the same baseline budget projections used by the Bowles-Simpson Commission, we have already achieved discretionary spending cuts equaling $1.8 trillion. Thus, we have, and that's even if sequestration is fully repealed in FY 16. So I think actually a major takeaway is that we need to not continue misguided austerity at the expense of creating jobs and economic growth.
Well, I would disagree with the hypothesis in that, or I'd agree with you in that you can only squeeze but so much blood from a turnip, which is basically what you're saying, which is on the domestic discretionary side, you probably squeezed it about as hard as you can. Are there other efficiencies to be found? Absolutely. But if you're really going to tackle this generational problem that's coming, this financial earthquake, I would argue, that's coming, you got to do it on the entitlement side. Where would you suggest to do it on the entitlement side?
Well, I would also push back and say I think we need to get out of the box that says we have to do it all in spending cuts. I mean, millennials agree in large numbers, according to polling that CAP has done with Hart Research Associates, that it's time for the wealthy to pay their fair share.
Gentleman's time has expired. Yes. You can respond in writing. Ms. Luan Grisham, recognized for 5 minutes.
I'm on. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and it's great to see a dialogue among a variety of age groups about these important issues. And actually, as a lawyer and a small businesswoman, you can do both, and I think that that's really the genesis or the focus of the hearing, which is in looking at some of the entitlement programs and the safety net issues, where can we make changes that are productive to both the families and the individuals who need that safety net investment, recognizing what value it has in the economy, and figuring out what those balances are. And so I really appreciate that. And this question, by and large, goes to Rebecca, but I want to highlight that in your answer to the last question, in fact, we're seeing that we're making the right progress in many places in terms of dealing with the deficit and the debt. And in fact, in this Congress, this is my third year, so my second session, we've had more than $611 billion of unpaid tax incentives. And so if the focus of this Congress was just to make sure that we're being fiscally mindful, that's not really occurring. And to make it all be the burden potentially on safety net programs is also, I think, a very shallow investment in what we could do to make a difference. So I agree that my sense is that the idea that we can just cut those safety net programs and those costs just go away is a dangerous fallacy. You squeeze it here, it bulges out someplace else. And in fact, I believe that if you cut Medicaid by $900 billion, as House Republicans are proposing in the budget, then you put more pressure on state and federal programs. And coming from a state that has the highest poverty levels, it's got the hungriest children, I think we've done a little bit better in that regard. I think we're now third worst in the country for hungriest children. We have the worst economy in the country. We have the worst behavioral health system and the worst overdoses and the worst drug abuse issues. And you melt away all of those investments, and there's no hope for creating a ladder of success and moving away from poverty in a state like mine. Medicaid is the country's largest payer for long-term care services. It makes up 30% of the Medicaid spending. With the graying of America, the notion that we won't provide any of those home care services or those investments, that folks will live 30 years in nursing homes, the most expensive investment, which eliminates the opportunity for families to take care of each other. And as a caregiver, I'm doing that. It's the wrong policy, it's the wrong investment, and it completely moves away from independence, dignity, respect, and family values. So I suggest that we got to find a different way to maintain these programs. And I'm going to run out of time. I've got examples about SNAP, I've got examples about hospitalization, and about how we're using these programs to really make a difference in the lives of families who need us. And I highlight that caregivers are now often younger people, including my 26-year-old daughter, who, while I'm here at the dais, is at my house making sure that my mother is getting the basic care that she needs so that you aren't paying $100,000 a year, of which she would be eligible, of Medicaid nursing home assistance. So, Ms. Vallas, how would cutting the social safety net program shift costs to other parts of the federal budget? State budgets, businesses, and loved ones in the family examples that I gave you. Do you agree that these costs simply just don't melt away?
The costs will not melt away, and I think that, as we've talked about today, in addition, cutting vital investments in our safety net and in social programs, social insurance programs, will also spell slower economic growth, as well as costing our economy jobs at precisely the time when millennials need more jobs, not fewer.
I agree. Anyone else on the panel want to take that on?
I would just say I would actually really welcome more of those costs being shifted to me as a business owner. If I paid less in taxes, I would love to fulfill this duty of helping provide for the social safety net. So I think we've got to remember the line. It's always easy to be generous with someone else's money.
Then why do you think businesses have been slow to do the things that really make a difference, include providing child care, long-term care insurance, elder care assistance? They've done none of it, and they've been great incentives, both tax incentives at the federal level, which have dissipated and disappeared today, but were alive and well in the 80s and 90s, and none of those investments, none of them, were picked up by the private sector.
Right. Well, the challenge is we have one of the highest
I mean, I do it in my business, but I will tell you that it's
Right.
not occurring, and it's not occurring in younger businesses either.
Right. Well, It seems like the United States has one of the highest corporate tax rates, so you're both taxing us egregiously and expecting us to deliver services. We can't
But
do
in my
both.
example, I said that where there were
Gentlemen-
tax incentives. So I mean,
Gentlemen's time has expired.
it
Yeah.
just hasn't occurred.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Chairman. It's lovely to see you again.
Likewise, likewise. Thanks for joining us today. Mr. Blum is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's lovely to see you again, Mr. Chairman, and Luann as well. And thank you for holding this most important hearing. And Mr. Baehr, I'm a career small business person in the high-tech industry and have taken the company public, but I must confess to you, I just found out what Periscope was yesterday.
Well, thank you. Congrats on that.
I've got a lot of questions, so maybe we can be brief in our answers, and we'll just go down the line here. Ms. Blair, do you understand or know what a zero-sum game is?
No, I do not.
Mr. Meyer, do you know what a zero-sum game is?
Yes.
Ms. Vallas? Yes. Mr. Baehr?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Well, according to the dictionary, a zero-sum game is, quote, one participant's gain is another participant's loss. Many in Congress, the reason I bring this up, many in Congress put forth the idea that if someone in America is getting ahead, then someone must be falling behind. Do you believe that? Do you believe that, Ms. Blair?
No.
Mr. Meyer, do you believe that?
No.
Ms. Vallas, do you believe that?
Do I believe that if someone's getting ahead, someone else is
Then
falling
someone
behind?
must necessarily be falling behind. Zero-sum game.
I think it depends on the context.
Okay, Mr. Baehr?
No.
Okay, 1963, John F. Kennedy had a great statement, and I'll paraphrase, a rising tide lifts all boats. What does that mean to you, Ms. Blair?
It means that economic growth will not benefit just the people at the top, but it will benefit everyone.
And did that happen in the 80s under President Reagan? Did the rich get richer, the middle class got richer, and the poor got richer?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Meyer, what does a rising tide lifts all boats mean to you?
I think it means the benefits of innovation tend to flow down throughout all parts of the economy and don't just stay with the creators.
Ms. Vallas?
I think, unfortunately, it spells a narrative that we've learned in recent history is no longer true, as the rich have gotten richer and average Americans are falling behind.
So economic policies do have consequences, correct?
Absolutely.
And the income disparity has gotten worse under this administration, correct?
The income disparity has gotten worse over the last 3 decades due to policies that long predate this administration.
And accelerated during this administration. Mr. Baehr, rising tide lifts all boats. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. As the tide lifts, we're all in boats. I think it's unfair to assume that we're all at the same level. To hear about Schwartzman having $500 billion or $1 trillion or whatever it is, we sort of have to think, like, is that fair? I think we have to say, well, what's the alternative? Did he and people like him create tens of thousands of jobs through the successful running of public businesses that generated massive economic value for lots of people? I think they probably did.
The facts of the matter is this economic recovery, these are the facts, this isn't partisanship, is the worst economic recovery in U.S. history post-World War II. Had we had a Reagan recovery versus an Obama recovery, we'd have 11 million more Americans working today. 11 million off of government dependency. And we'd also, the average family of 4 would have nearly $1,000 a month more in pay. Economic policies have consequences. And I'd like your honest opinion on this. Philosophical question. Do you think the Obama's administration, what do you think their attitude is, Ms. Blair, toward the private sector and business?
I think it's that the private sector needs to be controlled in a way and facilitated by the government sector.
Mr. Baehr, Mr. Meyer, what do you think the Obama administration's attitude is toward the private sector?
Well, I think that they almost overestimate that the private sector will continue to produce to the level it does if you keep increasing regulations and don't reform our internationally uncompetitive tax code.
Ms. Vallas?
I believe
Am I
that-
pronouncing your name the correct way? Vallas?
Closer than most.
Yes, great. I don't, Ms. Vallas.
I believe that the Obama administration has been dedicated to reducing deficits as well as spurring economic growth, and that's what we've seen for the last 5 to 6 years.
Mr. Baehr?
I think they've hired a lot of great people. They've brought in people from Google and Facebook and young millennials. The challenge is that finding the right public policies to create economic growth is really hard. And too often, for people that want to create a social safety net, the idea is that we can just raid the coffers of people like Steve Schwartzman and he won't even notice. Well, he will.
What do you think, Mr. Baehr, what do you think the president's attitude is? How does he view the private sector and businesses? What's your personal opinion?
Well, until I entered the world of business, I had no idea what it meant. And as far as I know, he hasn't really ever signed the front of a check.
Would you agree if we have more members of Congress who sign the fronts of paychecks, this might be a different and perhaps a better government?
I would welcome that. I would love some sort of cap on former lobbyists and lawyers representing the United States people in the Congress.
Very good. I've run out of time. Thank you very much for your
Time has
answers. Thank
expired.
you,
Mr. McClintock is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Meyer, your testimony covered tuition costs quite extensively. My two children have just graduated from college, and I've got the Parent Plus loans and the student loans to show for it. That's about all we have. My understanding is tuition costs have grown at about 4 times the rate of inflation over the past decade. When healthcare costs grew at twice the rate of inflation, that was considered a national crisis. Why is that? Why are tuition costs skyrocketing the way they are?
Well, there's quite a few factors, but I would say the number one factor is the current system of federal student loans, how we are pouring more and more money into students going to college because we still view going to college as a universal investment that will help each student.
Well, that's quite a revelation. In other words, if we offer colleges more money, they take it.
Yep.
And they take it by increasing their tuition.
And pay for administrators.
And then we enter this vicious cycle where the more money we spend, the more they hike tuitions. The more they hike tuitions, the more we have to spend to help kids try to make those tuition costs. And then we end up with the millennials graduating from college who are forced to take out enormous amounts of debt. They end up graduating into a lousy job market with tens to thousands, certainly tens of thousands of dollars of debt. And because of that debt, they then can't qualify for mortgages, so they can't enter the housing market. They can't qualify for consumer loans, so they can't make the consumer purchases that drive 2/3 of economic growth. How do we break this vicious cycle?
I think the first thing we need to do is look at how not all federal aid to colleges is made the same. For example, research has found that Pell Grants, which are targeted at low-income individuals who otherwise probably could not have attended colleges, do not have the same rate of increase as universally available subsidized loans or unsubsidized loans. So by what we're doing, though, and this is uncontroversial, is that the main beneficiaries of unsubsidized or of subsidized federal loans are from people from upper middle class and wealthy families. They're able to then attend a more expensive college.
We use the word beneficiary, I think, rather loosely. They benefit by graduating to a lousy job market.
That's true, the main recipients.
Enormous debt that they can't possibly repay. That hardly seems like a benefit to me. It seems like an illustration of what Reagan called the oldest lie in humanity. I'm from the government and I'm here to help you.
Yeah, and it's a shame because everyone who does want to make college more accessible to people, especially with low incomes, these programs were created with the best of intentions, but right now they've really spiraled out of control, and I think it's pretty clear, and as you summed up, that the colleges are taking the money and using it to raise their tuition costs.
Well, the nostrum we hear from the left, and I've heard it again extensively today, is, oh, well, we just need to spend more money and run up more debt. Well, that stimulates the economy. We give $1 to a person, they're going to go out and spend it. And it seems to me they completely ignore the other half of the equation. When you rob Peter to pay Paul, it's true, Paul's got an extra $1 to spend. That $1 is going to ripple through the economy. But Peter now has one less $1 to spend in that very same economy. And it seems to me that not only does not stimulate economic growth, it stimulates government at the expense of economic growth, but the impact on millennials is particularly pernicious. When we spend money we don't have, we end up borrowing from the future. Who's the future? The millennials. We took $1 trillion of stimulus spending at the beginning of this administration. $1 trillion comes to $9,000 of additional debt for every family in America. That is debt that is just as real as if it appeared on their credit card statements this month. In fact, it's more real because you have to pay that debt back before you can pay back your credit card statement, and the IRS gets very insistent that you do. So it seems to me millennials get none of the benefits of this massive, reckless government spending, and they get all of the cost of the deficit spending. How do we cure that problem?
I think the idea is to shift the idea of entitlement spending more towards safety net. I've heard multiple people referencing Social Security and Medicare under safety net programs. Well, that's more what they should be rather than just a giant entitlement idea that's taken away from Congress's authority. We need to be able to vote on every dollar that we're spending each year rather than creating these behemoths of programs that just grow on their own.
One more point. The other nostrum is, well, just tax businesses. But it seems to me businesses don't pay business taxes. Business taxes can only be paid in one of three ways. They're paid by us as consumers through higher prices, they're paid by us as employees through lower wages, or they're paid by us as investors through lower earnings, mainly on our 401ks or retirement plans. Is there any other way business tax to be paid?
And not really. And then when you're looking at it, if it could also be paid through the individual tax rate if businesses are owned as a sole proprietorship or through that. So yeah, there's...
Time has expired. Let me thank all of you for joining us today. I think it was very informative and enlightening for us, and appreciate the engagement that you demonstrated with each of the members who asked questions. I want to advise that members may submit written questions to be answered in writing at a later time, and we urge you to be responsive to those. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. Any members who wish to submit questions for the record may do so within 7 days. At this point, this committee stands adjourned.
There's some cool stuff happening in criminal justice. Hey, man.
That's why I
Sister, I was at Princeton, and she was there for postdoc stuff. Yeah. Yeah. So that Baehr is Ted Baehr, a legal guy. His son is a good friend of mine. So actually, no.